Good morning, welcome back. It is cold and windy. Middle of October though, so I'm not surprised. I'm trimming off my Ranunculus Corms. And my Ranunculus this year were terrible, if I'm honest. But the year before, it was a fantastic year. And that was due to a lot of factors. I'm confident that I can grow them well, but there's a few things that I did not pay a whole lot of attention to last year that I really should have, and I know better. Ranunculus need to bloom when it's still cool in the spring, and here in zone 6, we're in eastern Canada, they should be blooming by early June to get at least a month's worth of flowers, and they will repeat flower, which is fantastic as long as the conditions are favorable, i.e. no massive early heat wave, for one. But to get them flowering that early, that means I need to start them in February. And we were away for the second week of February this past year, so they got started a little bit late. I jammed them into seed trays, so they got very root bound. They got all stuck together, and they really didn't like being ripped apart and shoved into the ground when the soil temperature was still really cold. And they like cool, but cold is another thing. So I think what I'm going to do differently this year is pot them up into either large cell packs or individual small pots and grow them on for another month or so before I put them into the ground to make sure they have a good solid root system, and that would let the soil temperature warm up a little bit. I could plant them into a hoop house or something if I had one. I don't. We only really have a third of an acre here, and there isn't a great spot to put any kind of structure like that. It's not off the table. I just don't think that I have a great spot for it. So I think planting them up into larger pots or larger cell packs will do the trick for next year. Now this year they were so bad that I wasn't even going to save them, but the corms look better than I expected when I went to clear that bed, even though some of them didn't even really flower. So what I'm doing is cleaning up the corms, cutting the excess roots and the stems. So a ranunculus corm is this weird looking little thing full of these little octopusy tentacle. These are the roots, and the root pointy ends point down and the stem comes out of the top. And generally the bigger the corm, the more foliage and then the more flowers you're going to get. And that's what I'm looking for here are the bigger corms, and I'm keeping a lot because I can sort them again in the spring when I go to plant them. I don't know how much space yet I'm going to have to devote to these, so I'm going to keep as many as possible. So yeah, a lot of these didn't even flower last year. I did get one decent flush of flowers from about half the patch, so it wasn't a complete loss. But these are corms that I've been saving and building up my collection over the course of about 3 years. So I don't want to lose them all, and I only ordered about 100 new ones, and these are those right here. This is my new order. So to compare these new ones to these old ones, see if I can find a decent one. They're definitely smaller. They're not too bad. I think they'll be okay, especially given a little bit more growing time before they're triggered to start flowering. So I have a bed right over there that I planted all the ranunculus in this past year, and the size of the bed was great, but it's currently being emptied because I have other plans for this space in the spring, and so the ranunculus will have to be planted elsewhere for next year. But storing ranunculus corms is actually really easy because they can be completely dried out. They don't need to be protected in any way. Don't let them freeze. But I'm going to keep them in a cool, dry basement, just in a mesh bag just like this. You don't need to worry about the moisture content because they are completely dried out. I've even had corms that I've forgotten to plant and waited 1.5 years, and they did sprout. So they have a good long shelf life when they are dormant like this. And I do have videos covering growing ranunculus and starting it in the spring. So I'm not going to cover that today because we don't really want to be doing that until about February. So along with the bad timing, this was not the best spring for ranunculus. When they start blooming, the last thing we want is a heat wave, because when the temperatures get too warm, they're going to stop flowering, the foliage starts to turn yellow, and then they go dormant for the season, which is normal. But if that happens too early, then that's going to cut your flower season really short. So the weather does have a lot to do with it. Now here's a good example of one that actually multiplied, and now I have 2. So that's a bonus. I'm really happy that these didn't all go to waste, because I wasn't planning on being able to save any of them after the horrific season that I had this year. And I had so many really nice colors too. I had everything from white and marshmallow, which was a pale yellow. Some of these are no good, by the way. I'm just tossing them. If they're incredibly tiny, then they're just not going to produce a lot of flowers. But it looks like I might have about 200 good ones. So this is exactly how they came out of the soil, just with most of the top trimmed and tossed in these buckets and forgot about them. So this was really a job I could have done 3 months ago, but they've been sitting out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, which is a problem sometimes. So didn't start great, but it looks like a bit of a happy ending to my ranunculus season after all. Hopefully. We'll know for sure when I go to start these next year. But I do have 100 brand new corms that actually came with my wholesale tulip order, which is also still sitting in my cold back porch waiting to be planted. So there are a lot of jobs that I need to get on with this week. And I think what I'm going to do with the ranunculus next year is plant them in raised beds. I have 8 smaller raised beds on one side of me. I can easily cover them and keep them free of deer, etc. And when I planted these last year, the deer actually came through and pulled them. They didn't seem to eat them, but they pulled the foliage up and just left them sitting on the beds. So that wasn't great. But planting them in raised beds will mean that the soil temperature warms up a little bit faster. It doesn't stay quite as waterlogged, and I have worked on the soil quite a bit in these raised beds, so the soil is a little bit better than it was where I planted these last year, which I suppose was a raised bed, but it's an older one that I didn't pay much attention to. And when it comes to growing anything, soil is really the most important factor. I mean, there's a lot of important factors, but if you do pay attention to absolutely everything and don't pay attention to the nutrition of your soil might be okay, but if it's not, you are not going to get much. So to summarize today's jobs, I am trimming the small, tiny little roots that we don't need. I'm trimming off any remaining stem off the top because it's just going to grow a new one. And I'm tossing these into a bucket. And then when I'm done, hopefully quickly, as my hands are freezing, might actually finish this inside. Then I'm just going to bring it downstairs to my plant storage area where it's cool and dark most of the time. And then they're going to wait to get started in February. So that's all for today, and tomorrow I get to plant 2,600 bulbs. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you then. Thanks so much for watching.